Diena. Man labai sunku kalbėti lietuviškai, tai aš kalbėsiu angliškai. So I apologize that my Lithuanian is not good enough to give a whole lecture. People say that it's much better when I speak in English. So thank you for coming. I'm always delighted to be back in Lithuania. I have deep roots in Lithuania. Both my parents came from Lithuania. And my younger sister actually speaks Lithuanian very, very well. And I haven't figured out how she did that, but she did. So, for the last 42 years, I have been studying wild orangutans in the jungles of Borneo. I was very fortunate because I was encouraged to study orangutans along with Dr. Jane Goodall and Dr. Diane Fossey to study their respective apes. So when I went up to the late Louis Leakey and asked him for his help, he was actually very receptive because he already had two people who he had sponsored or helped, and those two ladies, of course, became world-renowned and are legendary figures. Jane Goodall is now one of the best-known scientists in the entire world. And my goal was to study wild orangutans, to study them as nobody had ever studied them before, because very little was known about wild orangutans when I began my study, and to be able to share that knowledge with future generations. So orangutans and humans share a common ancestor. That common ancestor diverged when about 14 million years ago, and the ancestors of chimpanzees and humans came down to the ground and entered a new ecological niche, while orangutans stayed in what was originally our Garden of Eden. And that Garden of Eden, of course, are the tropical rainforests of this earth. And you can see here, this is a photograph of a tropical rainforest in much of its glory, and what modern African day savannas look like. So, orangutans are great apes. There are other species of great apes. Chimpanzees, which consist of two species, bonobos, which used to be called pygmy chimpanzees, and what is known as common chimpanzees, except they're not really that common anymore. And then gorillas. And over the years, it isn't that the species have multiplied, but our taxonomic knowledge of them has increased. So now we have two species of gorillas. And when I first began my research many, many years ago, there was one species of orangutan, but now we have two. And again, it's really a matter of scientific fashion. An orangutan is an orangutan. Orangutans mate with each other, whether they're Bornean or Sumatran. But I'd like to talk a little bit about chimpanzees. I chose this photograph for a reason. And what do you think the reason is? People are looking so grim-faced at me. What does this tell you about chimpanzees? Well, first of all, they're gregarious, they're social, and they share many characteristics with humans that perhaps we are not so proud of. Chimpanzees kill, chimpanzees go to war, chimpanzees commit the equivalent of genocide, chimpanzees also practice cannibalism. They sometimes kill other chimpanzee infants and eat them. But chimpanzees also use tools. Chimpanzees also make tools. And in the early days of Jane Goodall's pioneering studies, she discovered that chimps actually made tools. And the definition of humankind at the time was that humans were the only animals that not only used tools, but made tools. So Louis Leakey made the very famous statement at the time that if that was the definition of humankind, then we should call chimpanzees human, because they also made tools. So in the past there was an overemphasis on tool using and tool making as a definition of what constituted humankind. Well, chimpanzees are our closest living relatives in the animal kingdom. They share about 99, actually it's 98.5, but you can up it to 99% of their genetic material with us. Chimpanzees are so close to us that they can be called sibling species, and they also, once blood types are matched, can also receive and donate blood. So there are people walking around on this planet who actually do have chimpanzee blood in their veins. They're very few. I've read a little bit about them. And I've always suspected that, Keith Richards of the Rolling Stones was one of them. And the reason that I suspect that is because one of the main uses of chimpanzees as blood donors has been when people wash their entire blood to clear it of any drug residue, or if they need to have their blood washed for another reason. Now, orangutan. So orangutan comes from the Indonesian or Malay words orang, which is person, and hutan, of the forest. So Indonesians have a very, traditionally, now they don't, but traditionally they had a very interesting belief. And they thought that orangutans were people, basically, who lived in the forest, in the tops of the trees, and who could speak, but chose not to use language, because then they would be put to work. And it's very interesting, because one of the things that does divide orangutans and chimpanzees and gorillas from humans is the fact that we use language, we use speech. Orangutans can be taught to use sign language. There's a famous orangutan at Camp Leakey who was taught sign language by one of my former graduate students. And Princess learned to use about 30, 40 signs that she put together in small sentences, in short sentences. So a typical princess utterance would be something like food, food, give food, or groom, groom, want groom. And it's very interesting because if you compare the development of orangutans to children, the intelligence of orangutans seems to be about the equivalent to a 3-year-old child. And that's when children begin to learn speech. That's when children begin to use language. So orangutans hit a brick wall because they do not use language. But in other kinds of intelligence tests, orangutans test very well. They sometimes test at the level of an 8 or 9-year-old child. So they're very smart, and I'm sure in some ways that we humans cannot fathom, orangutans do test better than humans. So, going back to 14 million years ago, our ancestors, the ancestors of chimpanzees and gorillas, left the forest, not willingly necessarily, but because the forest retreated. Africa became drier, and our ancestors were the ones who were left behind as the forest moved back. And those ancestors were the same as the ancestors of chimpanzees. I used to teach a class in human evolution at a university in North America, and I remember once when the first lecture of my class in human evolution, or human origins, there was a man in a suit at the back of the class, and I assumed he must have been a spy from the administration. He was a middle-aged man in a suit, right? All the other students were relatively young. And he asked me a question. He said, why did humans evolve? Right? I'm just out of nowhere. Why did humans evolve? And I thought about it for about a second or two, and the answer is because Africa got drier. So ultimately, we are Africans. Our origin is African. And this is something that we share with orangutans. Orangutans are also African. The earliest orangutan-like fossils come from Africa. But while we left the Garden of Eden, or the equivalent, tropical rainforest, orangutans stayed behind. And here you see an adult male orangutan in a tree nest up in the top of the canopy. So orangutans stayed behind while chimpanzees and humans and gorillas went forth onto the savannas and to the woodlands of Africa. And that is where chimpanzees and gorillas, of course, remain today. And chimpanzees in particular are very interesting because chimpanzees play both sides of the street. They can be terrestrial, because they knuckle walk, or they can be arboreal. But orangutans never left the canopy of the rainforest. So orangutans are basically arboreal. They spend about 95% of their time in the rainforest. And this is one of the many things that I have documented about orangutans. So I'm very fortunate that I was able to study orangutans. This is a picture of me that was taken many, many years ago. And you can see the date. Well, I once gave a talk to a group of underprivileged children in Florida. And one of the questions that they had was, the first question, in fact, the children had was, who is the woman? Who is that woman in the photo? Like, why do you have that woman there? And I had to explain that it was me many, many years ago, 40 years ago. And here's a much more recent version of me in the forests of Borneo with orangutans, because now we do a lot more than just study orangutans. We also work extremely hard to protect them and to save the forests on which they depend. So what makes an orangutan an orangutan? Well, there's a number of things that make them orangutans. First of all, we're very similar. I mentioned the fact that orangutans are highly intelligent. They share 97% of our DNA. They use tools. They don't so much make tools, but they do use tools. They do make tools, but they tend to make them in an idiosyncratic kind of way. But there are complexes of tool making and tool using behaviors that have been documented in orangutan populations in Sumatra. Orangutans also have very strong mother-offspring relations. Orangutans stay with their offspring for at least 6 or 7 years in Borneo, and the average is about 8 years. But in Sumatra, orangutans can stay with their mothers for at least 10 or 11 years. It's very... Do I get the feeling I'm being encircled? Oh, I'm sorry. Anyways, so getting back to what are our similarities, orangutans also share many of the same medical conditions and diseases with humans, but not to the same extent as chimpanzees. So, for instance, orangutans have never been documented to have HIV, for instance. You may notice in this picture, let's see if I can, oops, wrong, sorry, how do I go back here? I don't want to go escape. Yeah, I normally don't use, oh, this one, okay.
Is that okay?
Thank you. So, you may also notice there's something wrong with the orangutan's eye, and one of her eyes, and that's another similarity that orangutans share with humans, is as they get older, they get cataracts. They also, and sometimes they need cornea transplants. They get cloudy corneas. But orangutans are slightly different from humans in that regard, because humans tend to get cataracts and have problems with the corneas when they get much older. Orangutans are a deep forest species, so they tend to get them when they're much younger when they have more contact with the sun than they normally would do. Okay. And another thing that orangutans share with humans is a very close relationship with the mother. So, as I mentioned before, so close that food sharing between mothers and offspring is actually quite common. And of course, orangutans love to imitate. Humans are the imitator par excellence. We imitate so well that we have rules against imitation. I mean, your students here, you all know about anti-plagiarism rules, right? I mean, you sit down and copy something, then it's called plagiarism. Although people say if you copy from many sources, that's called scholarship. But, so, we're very imitative. I mean, Elvis Presley imitators are almost as good as the real thing. Well, orangutans are also imitative. And here we see a prime example. This is the orangutan who learned sign language, Princess, and one of her offsprings. And Princess loves to go joyriding in our canoes, one of our dugout canoes. And in fact, her son Prince travels in a canoe. He doesn't use the paddle, but he's been known to jump onto boats that are traveling downriver and frighten tourists out of their wits. And then when he gets to Camp Leakey, he jumps off, or when he gets to whenever he wants to go. So those are some of the similarities. Oh, I should mention one more similarity, and that is that orangutans live to within 70 years of age. In zoos, they have lived up to 60, 65 years of age. And I suspect in the wild, they can live up to 70 years of age. So they have lifespans that are very similar to humans. They also have, thank you. They also have development stages that are very similar to humans. In the wild, an orangutan female will not give birth to her first infant until she's 15 or 16 years of age. And our differences. And you'll notice we have totally different shapes. Orangutans also have the males have large cheek pads, and these cheek pads are a feature of dominant adult males. And in Borneo, they typically assume full cheek pad size, or the cheek pads assume full size when they're about 20 years old, or they're sometimes in the late teens. But in Borneo and Sumatra, adult male orangutans sometimes do not get cheek pads until they're 30 years of age. You can imagine that. And it all depends on who else is there in the forest. There are many other cheek-padded males, then that inhibits the development of cheek pads. And the reason has to do with the orangutan mating system, much of which I have documented. And the orangutan mating system is that once you become a cheek padder, you cannot tolerate the sight of another male. It's either fight or flee. And if you want to have access to a receptive female, this happens so rarely that there is a receptive female in the forest that you basically have to fight off other adult males in order to have access to her. And the reason is because orangutans, and again this is something that I was the first to document, have a birth interval in Borneo that is approximately 8 years. So an orangutan female will not give birth after she's given birth to an offspring for another 8 years. And during that 8 years, while the infant is suckling, while the infant develops into a juvenile, while the infant still follows her and occasionally clings to her, she will not be receptive or proceptive. Well, what does this mean? Well, think about it. If a female only wants to mate once every 8 years, there's going to be a lot of frustrated and grumpy adult males in the forest, right? And when the female becomes receptive or proceptive, she's like a golden fruit, and she attracts adult and sub-adult males from all around. So in this way, the orangutan reproductive system differs very much from the human system, or even the chimpanzee or the gorilla system. And I remember once giving a talk in Las Vegas, and a man shouted out from the audience something like, when I said that, orangutan males didn't have sex, only were able to have sex once every 8 years with a particular female, some guy in the audience shouted out, "It's not that different in married life." Anyways, so what are the other implications of females only becoming receptive once every 8 years? Well, in Sumatra, it's 10 years. It's often 10 or 11 years. And, people were surprised when I published 8 years, and then people went on to study Sumatran orangutans and discovered there it was even longer. It was 10 or 11 years. So you also have sub-adult males. So a sub-adult male reaches a size of an adult female, becomes bigger than her, and he is not yet a dominant adult male. He cannot really fight the adult males. So what the sub-adult males do is they traverse the forest and they forcibly copulate with females. And this is one of the reasons that local Indonesians say that orangutans end up copulating on the forest floor. They don't, but if a sub-adult male is trying to forcibly copulate with a female, in their combat, in their fight, in their struggle, they may end up on the forest floor because they start off in the trees. So, if you think about this, if you think about the fact that orangutan females only give birth once every 8 years, and that a female first begins to give birth when she's 15 or 16 years old in the wild, you can see that the reproductive rate is extremely slow. That orangutans may be particularly vulnerable to the forces that threaten their extinction. Now, another way that orangutans differ from humans is orangutans love to put things on their head. They just love to put things on their head. Now, humans obviously put on hats, but orangutans will put all kinds of strange things on their heads. And in the wild, they are the only great ape species that actually makes an overhead cover for their nests. If you give a burlap sack to an orangutan, to a human, the human will put the burlap sack, will go into the burlap sack feet first, right? Well, an orangutan, you'll see the head sticking out, right? But with orangutans, the orangutan will stick his or her head in, and all you'll see is the feet. This is very different. Well, I've talked a little bit about orangutan social systems. I've talked a little bit about the orangutan reproductive system. And the things that I've touched on indicate that orangutans are particularly vulnerable to extinction. The fact that they are solitary or semi-solitary in the wild actually is beneficial in terms of environmental threats, because you rarely find a group of orangutans together. In 42 years of research, the largest group of wild orangutans that I've ever seen has been 9, and that only lasted for part of one day. But the things that make orangutans particularly vulnerable to extinction is their long birth interval. If you wipe out the females in an area, that population is not going to bounce back like rabbits do. And it's going to be another 15 or 16 years before the infant females will be able to have offspring. They also are fruit eaters. They depend not only on the forest canopy to make their night nests, but they also depend on the forest canopy for well over 90% of their food. So orangutans need forests. And one can also say that forests need orangutans. And one of the reasons that forests may need orangutans is because orangutans are one of the primary, certainly not the only, but one of the primary seed dispersers in the tropical rainforests of Borneo and Sumatra. Orangutans also shape forests because as they make nests, as they travel, they're very big, they break off branches, and the subsequent effect is that trees and forests are bushier than they normally would be were orangutans not present. Orangutans tend to travel long distances. The adult males tend to be nomadic if they are not dominant. They only settle down in one area if they are dominant. The subadult males tend to be quite nomadic because they're searching for areas that do not have a number of adult males. And so an orangutan male can travel 100 kilometers, 200 kilometers in the course of his lifetime. So when you think of him as a seed disperser, he is quite efficient. And orangutans not only disperse seeds by swallowing them and then defecating them with a little pack of fertilizer, but also they sometimes store fruits in their mouths. And sometimes you see them in their night nests when they're asleep, before they go to sleep, having midnight snacks. And then, of course, they spit out the seeds. And then, of course, sometimes they have long fur. It doesn't happen very often, but a seed or a fruit will get caught in the fur. So I suspect that sometimes, because of this fur, and because orangutans are fruit eaters and also flower eaters, that orangutans may also pollinate some of the trees in the tropical rainforest. So what are the environmental threats that orangutans are facing? Well, this is a traditional rice field. The Dayaks are the Aboriginal people of Borneo. They have been there for thousands of years, and they practice traditional rice horticulture. Notice I say horticulture, not agriculture, because they do not have draught animals. What they do is they take a small piece of forest, usually less than a hectare, much less than a hectare. They chop down the trees, and then they burn the forest, and they use the ash as fertilizer. And as you can see from this picture, the forest tends to surround these traditional rice fields. So even though these traditional rice fields are a threat to the orangutan, they're not really much of a threat. They're a much greater threat to small birds and small animals that are not mobile, particularly mobile, who do get, their nests get burned and their young get burned when these traditional rice fields are made. But orangutans move. Orangutans can move ahead of slow fires that are typically found in Borneo, and so these traditional rice fields do not affect them a great deal. What affects them greater is the fact that the Aboriginal Dayak people of Borneo traditionally ate orangutans, killed and ate orangutans when they came across them. My husband is a Dayak. My husband is a slash and burn horticulturalist or gardener, and when he was young, he ate orangutan meat, and people, mainly men in his village, killed orangutans with blowguns that had poison darts. So now people tend to hunt more with air guns. Gun control is very strongly practiced in Indonesia, so you don't get a gun unless you're a police officer or borrow one from a police officer or an army person. So the traditional rice agriculture, somewhat of a threat to orangutans, but nothing compared to what is pushing orangutans to extinction, which is palm oil. If orangutans go extinct, it will be because of palm oil. And you can see this is a field that has been flattened, probably by bulldozers, but not yet burned. These fields, or you can see the excavator working. And palm oil is the number one cause of, would be the number one cause of orangutan extinction. The problem is that palm oil is so profitable, palm oil is so ubiquitous, that it's like, if you get a palm oil concession in Indonesia, it's like you are getting a printing press to print money. In Indonesia, 9 out of the 10 richest billionaires have made their fortunes in palm oil. And the one who did not make his fortune in palm oil made his fortune in tobacco. But he has seen the handwriting on the wall, and so he's now switched to palm oil as well. So palm oil has been one of the engines of wealth, and easy wealth in Indonesia. And it absolutely destroys the forest. Because with palm oil, the forest is 100% converted to plantations. And the Indonesian government has tried to have the palm oil companies leave a little bit of, what they call plasma, a little bit of forest aside for the animals, but it's not been very successful. When you have 100,000 hectare palm oil plantation and all you have to leave is 1,000 hectares, that's not going to be very healthy for the wildlife involved, especially the orangutans. And the reason is that orangutans have very large home ranges. And orangutan males, I mentioned, may roam over 100 square kilometers or even more. A female normally in the course of her lifetime roams maybe 30 square kilometers. So if you just have a small minimum, if you have a small area, it's not conducive to orangutan population viability. A colleague who works studying orangutan populations in palm oil concessions tells me that the minimum, absolute minimum that you need for orangutans to survive and not be trapped is 10,000 hectares. But you will only get a few orangutans there. And of course, the real issue ultimately is fire, because the palm oil concessions and other agricultural concessions, such as pulp and paper, after the trees are cut down, after the commercially viable species are taken out, they use fire to burn the rest of the tree stumps, whatever, the remaining trees, and to provide fertilizer for the first planting of oil palms. And the problem is that fire is the cheapest way to clear forest. It costs 1/3 what other means cost, and with accelerating global climate change, the frequency of El Niños has increased. Now, El Niño is a weather phenomena related to the warming of the South Pacific, and it brings drought to places like Borneo. It brings drought to Southeast Asia, and it brings floods and heavy rainstorms to the west coast of the United States. And it also has effects all over the globe, but mainly in the Pacific region. And with the acceleration of El Niño, what's happening is these long droughts that are characteristic of El Niño are becoming more and more frequent. So it gets easier and easier to burn the forest in order to establish palm oil plantations. It used to be that we'd get an El Niño maybe every 7 to 10 years. Now we're getting El Niños every 3 to 4 years. And I'm sure it's what do you call those cycles? That self-reinforcing kind of cycle. And of course mining. In Indonesia, the only kind of mining that there is strip mining. There are no deep mines. And then of course commercial and illegal logging. Now I suspect this is an illegal logger. This picture did not come from our national park, but virtually every single national park in Indonesia that has trees has illegal logging. And about 1/3 of the national park where I work, which is Tanjung Puting National Park in the province of central Indonesian Borneo, was destroyed by illegal logging combined with fire during the El Nino periods. This is all illegal. This was taken in the middle of the national park. So what is our organization doing? Our organization is OFI, and we do a lot of things. We're a very small organization. We have a sister organization in Lithuania, but we have been operating since 1971, and the foundation since 1986. And I apologize because I thought I had video on my little flash stick, but it's not there. I don't know what happened. But I think Neringa is going to show some video, so we'll make up for it. So one of the things that we do is we rehabilitate orangutans. In Indonesia and in Malaysia, which is the other palm oil producing nation, it is against the law to keep or sell or kill orangutans, but people do not obey the law. And one of the reasons they don't obey the law is because they think of orangutans as crop raiders. Because when the forests are decimated and there's nothing left, and people start planting oil palms, hungry orangutans come in because they have no place to go, no place to run, no place to hide, no place to find food, and they pull up the inner roots of stalks of the palm oil. And so they're seen, and then they ruin the plant, and they're seen as crop raiders. So, you know, people will kill them as crop raiders, which is totally against the law. People will kill orangutans, mothers, in order to get their infants. And an infant can be sold in Jakarta, which is Indonesia's capital, say for $1,000, maybe $2,000. Although in the field where I work, you know, somebody might buy one for $100 or sell one for $100. But you know, in a country where the average income is about $3,000 per year per capita, a $1,000 baby is it's a golden baby, right? You know, so it's a temptation for a lot of people, and it's against the law. And so, but as in many places, certain laws are not particularly enforced. So this is a very interesting story. This is Jakat, and Jakat was brought to us by an officer of the tourism department. Now, how did that happen? Well, at Camp Leakey, where I work, we now get about 16,000 tourists a year, and I encourage it. This was my hope, that we would make this place an international tourist attraction, that people would come, and people would illustrate and indicate to the Indonesian government that the outside world, and even people in Jakarta, consider orangutans a priority and consider the existence of tropical rainforest important, or the continuing existence of tropical rainforest important. So one day the tourism department woke up and said, my gosh, Camp Leakey is the #1 tourist attraction in the province of central Indonesian Borneo, or Kalimantan Tengah. Now, Kalimantan Tengah is not Bali. I mean, Kalimantan Tengah doesn't get that many tourists, but still 16,000 is quite a few. To a place that is isolated, takes 2 days to get there from North America. There are no direct flights. You need to take at least 3 different planes to get there. So 16,000, and there's nothing else there basically except a small town. So the tourism department woke up. And so this gentleman is Mr. Jakat. And he called me one day and he said, said, oh, he said, I found an orangutan. Somebody has an orangutan. And it was in a village called Nangabulik, which is about 100 miles away from where I stay, and from Camp Leakey. It's about 150 miles from Camp Leakey. And he said, why don't you come and get him? And, you know, it was one day's worth of travel, the most horrible roads you can imagine. You know, your back ends up hurting like heck. You know, after you finish the trip, it's up and down. And I said to him, I said, no. I said, you get him. I said, I'm just a private citizen. You are an official of the Indonesian government. You go get him. And to my surprise, he did. I never expected him to, but he did. So he brought Jack-At, which is a little infant you see here. And I don't know if you can tell, but Jack-At did not look very well. He was all covered with sticky stuff, and we couldn't even tell what it was, whether it was like sap, whether it was dried blood. And this is after he was washed, but you can still see there's something wrong with him. You can still see the remnants of the sticky sap. And he's sitting there, but he really couldn't hold his head correctly. You know, I really thought he was going to die. And I told our assistants, I said, really, please take care of him as best as you can. Give him special love and attention because he's not doing so well. And this is one of our vets. We have 3 veterinarians that work at Orangutan Care Center in Quarantine, which is where we have the orangutan orphans. We have 320 orangutan orphans that we take care of at the Orangutan Care Center in Quarantine. And she's just checking his teeth to see how old he is. Well, the same day that we got Jack-At, we got Maui K. And look at the difference, right? Bright-eyed, bushy-tailed, happy. I mean, you can tell she's all eager to go out and explore the world. And she, too, was brought in by Indonesian government officials. And we didn't have to ask. This is Maui K. These are 2 officials from the Indonesian Forestry Department. This is me. And this is a volunteer, a long-term volunteer who worked with us from Canada. And Maui K is doing well, and I'm happy to say that these 2 animals were brought in 2 months ago, and both of them are doing very well. But you can see she was brought in a cardboard box. Doesn't matter, she was brought in. But think about it, 2 orangutans came to us on the same day. The good thing is they were brought in by Indonesian government officials. The bad thing is their mothers must have been killed. And if 2 were brought in on the same day, that probably suggests or indicates that at least 20 to 30 mothers were killed, and their infants either killed and eaten, as sometimes happens with Dayaks, or the infants died, or the infants were kept as pets and never came to us. So, what I'm saying is that the orangutan killing is still going on, but we're doing the best we can to rehabilitate orangutan infants that come to us. And also we do a lot of, I won't call it confiscation, we do a lot of persuading to persuade people who have orangutans as pets to turn them over to us. And it gets easier as the orangutans get older, because orangutans do not make good pets. I mean, if you think an unruly puppy is a problem, you should see a typical orangutan who has the strength of an adult man, even though he's an infant or she's an infant, who can climb. You can't keep them in a playpen. They want to explore. They're like perpetual toddlers. They want to know everything. They're curious about everything. They're kind of like the prototypical primate in that old book that many of us read as youngsters called Curious George. And this is an orangutan infant who came in some time ago. His name is Lanang, named after the Indonesian police sergeant who brought him in. And this is Lanang a few years later. And he's doing well, and in a few years he will be ready to go back to the wild. And I'd like to tell you the story of Ulin. And this is a picture of her taken from the care book that we keep. Every orangutan who comes in gets a book. We call it a care book, and that's what our veterinarians write in. So we have a chronology of the medical care and the health of every infant. So Ulin came in, I don't see it, I think it was 2005. Anyways, she had an interesting story. You'll notice that there's a chip number, so every orangutan that comes in gets a chip on their left scapula. And this chip, it's not really a transmitter in the sense that you can only read it with a reader, a chip reader from about 8 or 10 inches away. It's kind of like the kind of chip that you would put in your dog or pet in the West. So Ulin came in, and she is blood group A. So orangutans share blood groups with humans. They can be either A or B. They do not have O. They cannot be universal donors. And of course you cannot receive blood from an orangutan. If you did, you would die. And the interesting thing is, a chimpanzee cannot receive a blood donation from orangutan because they would die as well. So that tells you how close we are to chimpanzees. Chimpanzees are closer to us genetically than they are to orangutans, even though in Indonesia people like to call orangutans gorillas. I don't know why, but I guess because they're an ape. So Ulin came to us. She was brought in by an Indonesian police officer, and what had happened was there had been some ethnic conflict between Dayaks and a group called Madurans, and so Madurans had fled the village, and they left Ulin under their house, tied by a metal chain by the ankle, and she did not get regular food for at least a month. So she was there under this abandoned house for about a month, and apparently the neighbors came by and occasionally gave her food, but nobody had really taken care of her. And when the Indonesian police officer saw her, he confiscated her, and he brought her to us. And when she first came, she was already a small adolescent female, but she weighed very little, and she never caught up. Sorry, it hasn't been 2006. What am I saying? It's been 10 years, so it was 2003. Sorry, 2003. So 10 years later, she still hasn't caught up. She's still smaller. She doesn't have much hair. She has about as much hair as in the picture. But in the last 6 months, we have been trying to give her extraordinary care, and she has been gaining weight. What does extraordinary care mean? Extraordinary care means that she's let out of her sleeping cage more often with volunteers or with assistants. She's given special food. People pay attention to her specifically. So finally, she may be catching up, because we tried to release the orangutans into the wild once they reach about 12 years of age, which she definitely has reached. So that's one story. Now, the other thing that we do is we protect forest, and we do patrols. And this is an ironwood tree in the middle of the park, and this ironwood tree is one of the largest that we have seen. This tree is at least 500 years old. It could be 1,000 years old, because in the in the Bogor Botanical Garden that was established by Raffles in 1812, there are ironwood trees that were planted in 1812, and these ironwood trees are about this big. So you can imagine, 1812, 200 years ago? Yeah, 200 years ago, this big. So this tree must be at least 500 years old. Probably more like 1,000 years old, because ironwood is very, very heavy, it grows very slowly, and it sinks in water. Our dugout canoes made of ironwood are very sturdy. People like them, but they don't capsize, they sink. So we do a lot of patrolling. We do a lot of, especially of the national park where we work. We also have a tree planting program, and these trees are light wooded trees. They're secondary forest trees, and this tree is about 20 years old. But again, it's a secondary forest tree, which means it doesn't live very long. It's the kind of tree that you plant in order to provide shade so the primary rainforest can come back. But 20 years earlier, you couldn't have taken this picture because there was absolutely not a single tree on the horizon, not a single tree in evidence. So we do some tree planting, but our main goal is to protect the old forests, the monumental forests that still exist in Kalimantan. And we also buy forest. And this is a map. This is our, the red spot is our orangutan care center in quarantine, 80 hectares, where we release the orphans every day. The dark green is the village protected forest, which we were instrumental in establishing with the Indonesian government. And then you can see the Rawa Kuno legacy forest, and this is forest, much of which is peat swamp forest, that we bought as a foundation from the local people who owned it, who were Dayaks, Aboriginal Dayaks. And this, the man in the uniform is the village chief, and the other man is just a local man. So when we bought Rawa Kuno forest, legacy forest, much of it has been disturbed, but we were also protecting monumental giants such as this one. This is taken in Rawa Kuno, the Rawa Kuno legacy forest. And it's difficult to buy forest. It's not easy to buy forest. And the reason it's difficult to buy forest is because we are competing with the palm oil companies. And if you remember what I said about palm oil companies, they have a printing press. We have nothing to offer. You make a big donation, we might give you a T-shirt. You know, so the competition is fierce, and this is the problem that orangutans face. If you look at a map of Indonesian Borneo, Kalimantan Tengah, and if you paint the palm oil concessions and the pulp and paper concessions and the projected palm oil and pulp and paper establishments red, you get a map that looks blood red. I mean, it's fearsome to see. It's really quite hideous. And that's what we're facing. And that's one of the reasons why we cannot return orangutans to the wild. You have orangutans like Ulin and Lanang, that I showed you pictures of, who are ready now, or will be ready very soon, to be turned back to the wild, returned to the wild. But there's very few places where we can put them. We also do a lot of community and education outreach. And the reason we do this is because the only people who can save orangutans are the Indonesians. So you have to persuade them that Indonesians and forests are worthwhile saving. So we go out into the villages and we print coloring books, explain to children. We try to infiltrate the schools, school programs. And then one of the things that we have been doing for the last year, and this is very, very important, is we are training palm oil managers for the biggest palm oil company in Indonesia, which is called Sinar Mas, how to implement a zero-tolerance policy for killing, capturing, and harming endangered species. So we have 4-day sessions. I do this as a volunteer, but we also have paid trainers who help us, professional trainers. And you can see we have classroom sessions the last 3 days. And then we also have field sessions where they go to Camp Liki, where they go to the Orangutan Care Center in quarantine, and they actually see, and to a certain extent, interact with orangutans. It makes all the difference in the world. These are the palm oil plantation managers whose laborers whose employees are killing orangutans. So we are persuading them that since the company now has a zero tolerance policy, which took us 10 months to negotiate with the company, that this will no longer be tolerated by the company. See, it doesn't matter what the law is. It's what the company says are the rules and regulations. You know, if you don't get promoted because you allow orangutan killing, that's going to make a much bigger difference to you than, you know, there's a law somewhere that says you can't kill endangered species. So we're very, very pleased. This is one of the best things I think that we've done. And also we do research. This is a picture of me many, many years ago when I followed wild orangutans day in, day out. The research continues. The research is mainly carried out by my staff, my local Indonesian staff, and by students. And the problem is that what I spoke about, the destruction of the rainforest, is not just in Indonesia and Malaysia and Southeast Asia, it's worldwide. So here we have a picture of the burning of forest in Brazil to establish soybean plantations. So we can talk about a number of endangered species. We can talk about endangered environments, endangered habitats. Here in Lithuania, what is it, the maritime warbler? I think it's down to about 60 pairs because woodland habitat is being destroyed or has been destroyed by farming activities. So, and we have polar bears. There are fewer polar bears in the world than there are orangutans. We estimate that there's about 40,000, at least 40,000 orangutans in Borneo, less than 6,000 orangutans in Sumatra. But around the Arctic Circle, there's maybe 20,000 polar bears. So this is a crisis that is affecting every place. There's no place that is immune. And there seem to be few species that are immune. And those species tend to be temperate species with very wide ranges, even though specific populations may go extinct. An example are wolves. You still find wolves, but virtually every place where you find them, they are locally in trouble. So people ask me, what can they do to help orangutans? Well, the number one thing that they can do is they can stop palm oil consumption. Well, it's easier said than done, that old song, because you find palm oil in everything. It's ubiquitous. I mean, I didn't know until I looked up the slide that you can have palm oil in ketchup, tomato ketchup, and in mustard. You can have, palm oil is found in soap, it's found in toothpaste, it's found in detergents, it's found in candy, and food, beverages. Who knew that 7-Up had palm oil in it? And I remember being shocked when I came back to North America, and I was in Hawaii, and for some reason I bought some milk for my coffee, and I looked at it, and palm oil in it, because it was skim milk, it was low-fat milk. So now I buy full-fat milk, because it has no palm oil in it. Because when they take out the fat, they take out the vitamin A or whatever it is, and so they have to put it back in, so they put it back in with palm oil. So it's astonishing. And of course, what we can do to help orangutans and all those endangered species and all those endangered habitats is to live a more environmentally considerate lifestyle. And you don't need me to stand here in front of you and tell you how to live a more environmentally considerate lifestyle, because I think we all know: use less, recycle, reuse, all those good things that we've heard about for a long time. So, as we watch the great apes, we're also watching our own future on an increasingly inhospitable planet. And the planet is becoming more inhospitable. With global warming, I've read the predictions on it, that the ice in Greenland is thawing much faster than anybody predicted. Cities are going to be swamped, so on and so forth, with water, with floods. And this is a video that I was going to show you, but I'm not the best person with computers. Look at my age. So I can't show you the video, but this is my son, who's in the red and blue, who works with me occasionally, not always. He has his own separate life, but he also is very helpful. This is Fred. And me taking an orangutan back to the forest. And this is a video from the IMAX movie Born to Be Wild, which apparently is now one of the top 5 IMAX documentaries ever made in terms of the amount of money that is grossed, which is, of course, how we measure success in the movie business. So I'd like to end with a story, and the story is from a while ago. It happened while Al Gore was still Vice President of the United States, and he came to Los Angeles, and I happened to be in Los Angeles. And one of the benefits of being in Los Angeles is there are a lot of film industry events. So this was a film industry event, and there were maybe 1,000 people there. It was at one of the studios, and I was invited, to have dinner with Al Gore, along with 1,000 other people, but Vice President of the United States, so you know how long ago that was. And Al Gore arrived late because he had just come from Washington, D.C., and he had a number of, fundraising or whatever political things that he had to do in Los Angeles before the dinner. And so he arrived just when people were finishing their dessert and having their coffee. And so when he came in, there was a buzz in the room. People were clinking their silver spoons against the porcelain coffee cups, and there was a lot of noise. And I'm an academic, so I normally carry, pen and a notebook, because I wanted to listen to his speech and make notes on it and see what he had to say, because already he was emerging as a spokesperson for environmental causes. And so I'm listening to him, and I knew most of what he had to say. He talked about the ozone layer, the hole in the ozone layer. He talked about the destruction of the world's oceans. He talked about the destruction of the world's tropical rainforests. He talked about everything. The one thing he didn't talk about was global warming, global climate change, because I guess the scientists had not yet put it on the world's radar. And then he said something that I will always remember, and he said that the conservation crisis was a spiritual crisis. And it hit me then and there that if it's a spiritual crisis, then it's a crisis that will have to be solved by individuals. So, and that each of us has to look into ourselves and try and decide if this is really important to us, if the future of orangutans or the future of nature is important to us. And if it is, then perhaps we have a responsibility, a spiritual responsibility, to deal with it. So I thank you very much for your attention. Thank you for being here, and it's always a pleasure to be back in Lithuania.